If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Romans, the 1st chapter. This is where we will spend our time today. Paul is going to give us a further description of the fallen human condition, and he's going to give us a diagnosis of the inevitable outcomes of a world of human beings, sentient human beings, who are captured in wrongdoing. They are unable to extricate themselves from it. They've got enough light to find the truth, and they know the moral law within. And the entailments of the moral law and what happens to us when we disobey and walk away from both things. Let's take a look at this text, and I'm going to read this text in a particular way. I'm going to make it inclusive as opposed to just an abstraction wherein we're studying somebody else, because this text applies to us. So let's take a look at it in that way. Verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of everyone who suppresses the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in us. God has shown it to us. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that we are without an excuse. Because we knew God, but we did not glorify Him as God, nor were we thankful, we became futile in our thoughts, and our foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, we became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible humans, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore God gave us up to an uncleanness in the lusts of our hearts, to dishonor our bodies among ourselves. We who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave us up to vile passions. Our women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature, and likewise also our men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in our lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of our error, which was due. Hard to read it that way because it's easy to make a mistake, but nevertheless I think you get the point that this applies to all of humanity. This is not unique to a certain group. We tend in the church to see it as a certain group, but what do we got here? We've got a picture of a world in chaos and loving it. Loving being in the chaos. Paul is providing for us, if we're willing to accept it, an explanation for what he saw at his time and what we see in ours. Nothing has changed. The basic building block of humanity is one person at a time, and the basic building block is unchanged through these centuries. It's not a pure ignorance here that results in the misbehavior. Paul is saying we know what to do. There is a suppression. Misbehavior then will beget misbehavior, and the truth eventually will become invisible to us because we can no longer see it. There is a sense of natural responsibility, and you know what the word responsibility means. It means the ability to respond. That natural responsibility is a God-given thing. We all have it. Francis Crick, the geneticist, microbiologist, said this. He said, we enter our labs each day studying mechanisms that appear to be designed. And we have to remind ourselves constantly that they are not. What is he doing? He's suppressing the obvious. There is an obvious truth here to the fact that these systems are designed. They show the fingerprints of design, but we're going to assume that they are not and remind ourselves each day of that. It's a fascinating thing. The human mind is so diverse and so capable in its ability to suppress the truth that it knows to be so. God labels us then without excuse because of the light that we do indeed have. Now, there's an implication here theologically. a lot of implications, but one in specifics. We know that God is. Now, everybody knows it. There are people who will say, I don't believe in God. That's fine. I understand what they're trying to communicate. The syntax makes sense to me, but there's a sense in which I ask the question, then what is it we're talking about here? When you say you don't believe in God, what is it you're speaking of? Can you articulate that? Well, if they can, then obviously there's a knowledge there. Deep down, all of humanity knows. And there's an evidence for this. The evidence is throughout recorded history, even at the point at which there is no real record, we can only glean it from artifacts, cave paintings, and things like that. There is this sense of worship. This sense of seeing something about the cosmos that presents us with a sense of awe. And from that awe, we have a recognition, looking at the regularity and all of the things around us, that natural theology that emerges from nature. God's two books that we have today, the Bible and nature. And from that nature, we see the power of a designer emerging. Now, we see ourselves as wise and liberated. But there is a word that is translated here out of the Greek, and it literally says that we are morons. That's the word that is translated here. It's the word from which we get moron. And so Paul is saying to us, we are morons, but we are deliberate ones. We're not morons because of some genetic defect. And it gets worse. Once we pursue moronic behavior and moronic ignorance, deliberate moronic ignorance, God then abandons us to ourselves. He turns aside and he says, if that's the way you really want it, then go ahead. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's comment. He says, there are two kinds of people that come to God. One of them says, God, let your will be done. And the other one, God says to them, let your will be done. Well, this is exactly who Paul is describing here. Those who would say to God, I don't want your will. And God says, then your will be done. Go ahead. He steps aside and he says, you can have it your way. And so then we believe a lie. We believe that the creation itself is to be worshipped. I've listened to many atheistic scientists of various disciplines say that very thing. They look at the biological diversity and the complexity and they say, I step back from it with awe. Or I look at the cosmos and I step back from it with awe. There is a hunger in us to have that sense of awe. But we apply it to the creatures and the cosmos and four-footed beasts, as Paul says here, and so we are abandoned to worship that which is not God. God is a loving Father, just as any good parent would, says, okay, I'm going to step back and let you do what you want to do, with all of the consequences flowing. And then we humans see ourselves as, in our minds, truly free. Now we're free. We're free from the fetters. We're free from all the constraints. Now, a lot of people look at this passage in our day and they say it's an anachronism. It's out of date. It's a reflection of a cruel deity who won't let us do what we want. God is angry. He's an angry God. We don't like an angry God. Well, what about God's anger? Is there such a thing as a legitimate godly anger? All of us in this room obviously would say yes, but what about it from a purely philosophical perspective? God's anger is expressed in a very specific way in this passage. We're receiving here a revelation from God to us that we could not know otherwise. God's anger is expressed perfectly here. How does he express it? He gives to us what we insist that we really want. That's how he expresses his anger. He gives us what we want. He abandons us to ourselves. That's the whole context of the passage as it goes forward. God is the ultimate libertine. He builds into us, as Paul says here, the moral law. It's in us, but then we get to choose whether to obey it or not. God doesn't direct wrath at those who obey the moral law. Paul indicates there is this active role for unbelief. It is a suppression. And God's wrath abides in the suppression of him within a person. Now you may say to yourself, well, okay, what form does this wrath take? The wrath is formed in us via a guilty conscience. We know deep down what it is we ought to do. There is an ought that haunts the universe, and we know it. And when we don't obey the ought, we feel the guilt. That is God's wrath being expressed within us. We hear this phrase, I see it on church placards all over the place, God bless America. And I say to myself, how in the world can any believer look at America and ask God to bless it? I love this country, but gosh, I would say were it not for the fact that there are real believers in this country, I hesitate to say what God's expression toward this country would be. Maybe it'd be better if we turned that into a little bit more of an epigram. God bless America. No, America bless God. Perhaps that would be a better way to look at it. But there is this natural theology, this evidence of nature, the book of nature that emerges from the creation to our minds that we can make choices about. And we choose to recognize it for what it is, or we choose to suppress it. And it's our choice. The wonders of nature are awesome. They are. And when I read a scientist who looks at the cosmos and the complexity of it, particle physics, the biology, the intricacy of life itself, what life contains, the intricacy of the human mind, the human body, a cell, all of those things. There is an awe that flows from those things to me. But then what is the point of the awe? Is the awe the end in itself with regard to the object, or does it point to an artisan? Does it point to somebody else? I would say yes, that's the intention of it. The scientist may feel wonder at these things, but it should not stop there. Should it not then point to an awe that is reflected toward an author of these things? God, in our theology, is a necessary being. It means simply that he exists on his own without any sense of contingency. He simply is. That's the whole beauty of the revelation of God given to Moses at the bush. On, the being. Ego eimi, I am. The being. The being. Science in the 16th and 17th centuries, as it exploded in that period of time, we look at it from the Enlightenment point of view. That's a portion of what's going on. But the only reason the Enlightenment could happen is it was built on a theistic premise, and that is there's an artisan behind what we see in the universe, and it is intelligible to us because a rational being created it and created us along with it. And so it makes perfect sense that we should be able to intelligently study the universe. It makes sense that the universe should be susceptible to our mathematics in description. The reason is God made it. There was an intelligence behind everything. And so that intelligence is expressed in the fact that we notice that we're able to mathematically apprehend the universe. It's an incredible miracle to me. Why should the universe be susceptible to our mathematics? Why? It's a good question. Fallen humanity assumes that the fallen universe is the intended universe, but that is incorrect. Bertrand Russell, the great atheist from the last century, in his book, Why I Am Not a Christian, which is a good read for any Christian. If you want to find one of the most cohesive statements of unbelief of Romans chapter 1 here in print, that's a good way to start. But Bertrand Russell says, look at the flaws in creation. Look at the flaws in so many, in our bodies. Look at the flaws in the way that photosynthesis takes place. Look at the flaws, and then step back from the flaws in the cosmos, that suns burn out, that things happen in the cosmos that seem destructive. Well, anybody who's rational, he says, could improve on the mechanisms. But does he ever stop to think that that's a glorified hindsight at the wonder of the mechanism that is there? And it's an assumption. It's an assumption that some of these processes that to him look destructive aren't part of two things. One, a universe as it's constituted, and two, a fallen one. That the universe is not the way it's supposed to be. It's been damaged. That makes perfect sense, and it happens to be biblical. So, human hubris then overcomes really critical rational thought and stops at a certain point. It doesn't go the next few steps to discover why these things are the way they are. It stops with the way they are as brute facts and then draws a conclusion from it. God, there couldn't be a God because things are messed up. Things don't look right to me. What if the whole show, do we ever ask ourselves the question, do they ask themselves the question, what if the whole show, the universe, isn't the way it's supposed to be? That's a legitimate question to ask. The result of this perversion of truth is that we then wind up worshiping the wrong things. The modern day unbeliever, it seems to me, as I read, worships science. Science is the only legitimate way of knowing. Science is omnicompetent. It will eventually uncover all of the answers to everything at the most fundamental level. And the result of this is we lower the concept of God beneath our own station in the universe. And then once we get to that spot, we realize we're not God, and therefore God doesn't exist. These are the ways these mechanics shake out. But what if there is an intent still within the universe for humanity? What if there is what is known in philosophy as a telos, an end, a purpose? What if that? Do we ever ask ourselves the question in all of our glorified knowledge, could it be that the best human flourishment is supported by God being known by the human creation? Could it be that when we're not connected to the Creator as creation, and we don't allow the knowledge of God to penetrate our hearts, that we worship lesser things? Is that not Paul's argument here? Could it be? Could it be? Then we're no longer flourishing at our maximum flourishment as fallen flesh, as fallen human beings in this fallen cosmos, because we disconnect ourselves from God, the Maker. Could it be then that once we reach that sense of lowered flourishment, that then our perceptions of the reality we see become fundamentally distorted? They can never be perfect because we're fallen. But when we remove ourselves from the source of the creation and begin to look at the creation itself as the thing that brings us that sense of awe, are we then looking at things in a fundamentally distorted way? These are legitimate questions. They are legitimate. And they're questions that are not being asked in our world today. So let's just take this in an if kind of proposition and examine it for just a moment. If God is, then there are implications that would logically follow. One, He would have to be eternal. I mean, if we go into that realm of saying, well, somebody made God, then what about that maker? And then what about that maker? And we go back into an infinite regress. There has to be a stopping point. There has to be a point at which the non-contingent is. That is, the thing that stands alone as necessary for everything else. So, if God is, then we're going to speak of God in those terms, because it makes no sense to speak of him existing in any other terms. That means he is the maker of all, and everything outside of him is then contingent, dependent. The second thing which would flow from that is we're dependent upon him for life. Well, that brings us to that sense of response ability. The ability to respond. Would we not have it? We're sentient. We're sentient. And so there is a sense in which there is an accountability that would flow from that. 3, if we're to know what God expects, then we have to be told it somehow. He has to reveal it to us. 4thly, if we're rational, which we seem to be, it is because we reflect the rationality of a maker being made in his image, which is the revelation the scripture gives us. He made them male and female in his image. And 5thly, in our rationality, we are then able to choose. That flows from the sense of rationality, and it also flows from the sense that clearly God has made choices. If we're made in his image, then it would flow that we have that capacity. One of the capacities of his image would be that we, as a created being, would have the capacity then to make choices ourselves. And in that choosing, we can choose to accept the knowledge he provides, or we can choose to reject it. That flows from the fact that the highest ethic in the known universe would be love. And if we reject it, does it not follow that we will then be bereft as a race of beings of something that is fundamental to our flourishing, that has 2 components? 1, only God can give it. And 2, he would choose to do so. But we choose to reject it. Those implications make sense to me. They make a lot of sense of Romans 1 as well. So as we come to this text, let's examine ourselves and say, what parts of this text's description do we hold within ourselves? And what parts of it would we do well to hand over to the maker of the universe, to draw closer to him, such that the maximum flourishing we could have as fallen human beings, God would allow us. And he will. He will. I don't know where everybody is today, but if there's anything about which in this text I've said that you have a question, you want to speak with me after the service, I'll